you. Caravaggio was controversial. And by the way, this is Caravaggio on the right. This is a young actor playing the young Caravaggio in the great Derek Jarman film on the left. More about that later. In a who's who of painters, his police record would take first place. His antisocial behavior ranged from throwing a plate of artichokes at a waiter to killing a man over a tennis match. And he was equally controversial in his art. Few painters in history have provoked such extremes of praise and condemnation from their contemporaries. No major religious painter had so many altarpieces rejected, only to be snatched up by some of the most discriminating connoisseurs of the day. Caravaggio was praised and damned for one and the same thing: his bold and often brutal naturalism, his revolutionary aim to paint the people and objects of the natural world as he saw them. To do otherwise, he claimed in a rare statement about his art, would be but bagatelles, child's play. He was admired in his time, but begrudgingly, considered a useful reformer who restored naturalism to art, who brought it back down to earth after decades of flights of mannerist fantasy. On the right, Parmigianino's mannerist conversion of Paul. But at the same time, a revolutionary who went too far. It is true that painters who strayed too far from nature needed someone to set them on the right path again, but how easy it is to fall into one extreme while fleeing from another. So wrote the late 17th century biographer and critic Bellori, who labeled Caravaggio a mere imitatore della natura, an imitator of nature, who often, in his words, degenerates into low and vulgar forms. Well, 4 centuries later, we can perhaps better appreciate the paradox of Caravaggio, that powerful genius who broke into Italian art at the dawn of the Baroque like a bolt of lightning, electrifying his own age and sending a current down through the art of the entire 17th century. He lived only 39 years, his career confined to 2 decades and a few dozen major commissions. He had no workshop, no students or studio of assistants, yet he left an indelible imprint on artists to come, including Rubens, Rembrandt, and Velázquez, to name a few minor examples. His early years are shadowy. Born in Milan in 1571, he was named prophetically Michelangelo. His father, Fermo Merisi, was major domo and builder, perhaps architect, for the Marchese of Caravaggio, a small nearby town where the nobleman had his country estate. When young Michelangelo was 5, the family moved back to Caravaggio to escape an outbreak of plague, but his father died a year later. Yet the family had property, so the boy probably had a normal schooling, Latin, catechism, sums. Before he turned 14, he was apprenticed to Simone Petrosano in Milan for 4 years, an eminently forgettable painter who signed himself pupil of Titian. Then he was back in Caravaggio for a few years. Approaching his 21st birthday in 1592, with his share of an inheritance, his mother had died 2 years earlier, he set out for Rome, still the cultural capital of Europe and Mecca for aspiring artists, perhaps traveling with his brother who went there to study for the priesthood, and probably meeting up with his uncle, already a priest in the papal city. A Vatican lawyer, Monsignor Pucci, housed him in exchange for turning out copies of devotional pictures to be shipped back to Pucci's hometown for sale. Caravaggio, by the way, nicknamed him Monsignor Insalata, because I gather salad was the main course at every meal. The next year, Caravaggio teamed up with a young Sicilian painter, 15-year-old Mario Minetti, his companion and helper for several years to come, and he turned out hack work for a Sicilian painter named Lorenzo, small pictures to be sold on the street or in Piazza Navona, as we still see today. Hospitalized for a lengthy stay following a kick by a horse, he painted several pictures for the prior of the hospital. Well, his first good break came in 1593 or 4, when he was hired by Giuseppe Cesari, later known as the Cavaliere d'Arpino, a leading Mannerist painter of the day, to specialize in painting flowers. His Boy with Fruit, here in the Borghese collection, work of about 1592, illustrates his early proficiency in still life. The anatomy, somewhat less convincing. From this time dates his first self-portrait as a pale greenish Bacchus, the so-called Bacchino Malato, sick little Bacchus. Well, after 8 months with Cesari, he found a well-connected patron, Monsignor Petrignani, a high-ranking Vatican official, and moved into his palace. For Petrignani, he painted the fortune teller in the Louvre, and the more recently rediscovered card sharps in the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. 2 multi-figured genre paintings, each featuring a witty deception and perhaps illustrating misadventures of the prodigal son. The card sharps here caught the eye of Cardinal Del Monte, who purchased it and in 1595 took Caravaggio into his palazzo near Piazza Navona. The cardinal's sophisticated, rarefied, precious milieu is reflected in such works as the Metz Concert, work of 95 or 96, and the Hermitage Lute Player, about the same time, both featuring music and androgyny. This lutenist was mistaken for a girl by Bellori, replete with symbolism beneath the erotic surface. Is this platonic or salacious? Well, we must be careful and remember that at this very time, every Juliet in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet was played by a boy actor. The subsequent Bacchus in the Uffizi, with his ungodlike red cheeks and hands and dirty fingernails and decaying still life fruit, and here the boy bitten by a lizard in London at the National Gallery. These have provoked various complex interpretations ranging from overt homoerotica to moralizing genre, with symbolic cherries and flowers of love, as if to say, there is no rose without thorns, or watch out for the pricks. Now, note the carafe. In this carafe, this brilliant detail of the artist's studio window reflected. From this same time dates his earliest known religious works. Here, the Ecstasy of St. Francis in Hartford, Del Monte's patron saint, Francesco, and indeed this supporting angel might well have been recruited right out of his musicians, and natural, campfire, sunrise, versus supernatural light, this miraculous glow around the figures. It's an original interpretation of the stigmatization of St. Francis, for there is no seraph, no angel to be seen in the sky. Now it's entirely an internal, private vision, the first example of a major Caravaggio theme that still resonates 80 years later in marble in this late Bernini's Ludovica Albertoni. Caravaggio's Penitent Magdalene in the Doria Pamphili in Rome could easily be mistaken for a contemporary genre scene, but for the jar of ointment and the pearls, emblems of Mary Magdalene, at her side, which were added by painting out a corner of her dress. We may compare her to the year or two later regal St. Catherine, same model, with still life of martyrdom, the wheel, the sword, the palm branch of martyrdom and victory, and the faint halo that once again lift the image out of genre or portraiture. This darkening atmosphere now already foreshadows his Judith in Rome in the National Gallery, the first example of high drama and violence in a biblical scene. Now the sword, as we see, is very much shown in action. And it's the same model, but here as the Old Testament heroine, Judith, who's beheading Holofernes, and the Assyrians' silent scream is later adapted by Caravaggio to the Medusa, whose horrifying head had turned men to stone, here painted on a ceremonial shield given to Ferdinando de' Medici by Cardinal del Monte. The Judith marks a turning point, away from the softly lit pictures of profane pleasures to dramatic religious subjects, illumined by metaphysical light, where the beheading takes place at midnight. So this light, too warm to be a lightning flash, clearly emanates from a divine supernatural source, and the setting is minimal, while gesture and psychological drama and content fill the canvas. We may compare this with his brilliant masterpiece of this new mature style, The Supper at Emmaus in London at the National Gallery, a work of around 1600. It's almost identical in dimensions and format, a tour de force of technique and innovation by Caravaggio now approaching his 30th birthday. This is the painting that Bellori singled out as illustrating the artist's failing in decorum. Bellori castigated the rustic character of the two apostles, the Lord, who is shown young and without a beard, the innkeeper's failure to remove his cap, and a basket of fruit out of season. For the biblical scene, as we know, takes place the day after Easter or in springtime. Yet, 3 centuries later, the American abstract painter Frank Stella would write in the New York Times that abstraction today wants to make sure it can have everything Caravaggio served up in The Supper at Emmaus, a painting filled with projective gesture, psychological presence, and pictorial import. Caravaggio here follows St. Luke's account of the story and the Venetian tradition, as we see in Titian, of a startled recognition at the moment Christ blesses the bread, a variation on Leonardo's Last Supper. The resurrected Christ's far-reaching gesture is framed by the thunderstruck disciples, the right one flinging his arms out in the form of a cross as though to exclaim, "But Lord, you were crucified." The Renaissance theorist Alberti wrote that the movements of the body reflect those of the soul, and therefore thought and feeling should be conveyed through outward gestures by artists. Well, already Caravaggio reveals himself a master of psychological and dramatic rhetoric. His gestures speak louder than words. But what of some of Bellori's complaints? Well, let's cross-examine him. First, the youthful, beardless Christ, so unlike the familiar face of Jesus. The great Berenson called him, against all tradition and precedents, a boy preacher startling the yokels out of their wits. Yet, this face reveals Caravaggio's brilliant solution to the mystery of why these disciples had failed to recognize him. An original solution he based on Scripture. St. Mark's brief reference to the risen Christ appearing to his disciples, in alia effigiae, in another likeness. The particular likeness he chose harks back to the earliest type of Christ in Christian art, as we see on the Junius Bassus sarcophagus, and revived a millennium later by Caravaggio's namesake, Michelangelo, in his famous Last Judgment, also the source of Christ's contrapuntal gestures. The innkeeper has failed to remove his cap in the presence of the Lord precisely because he remains outside this miraculous revelation, lit by metaphysical light, the light of enlightenment. But his head casts a symbolic shadow, a negative halo, so to speak, above Christ's head, where we would expect a more traditional one, perhaps signifying that even those ignorant of Christ may yet honor him subconsciously. Likewise, the basket of fruit, admittedly out of season, but here richly symbolic with Eucharistic grapes, the apple of Adam's fall, and a pomegranate, symbol of resurrection. It recalls Caravaggio's early still lifes and rivals his only pure surviving still life, that magnificent, even monumental basket in Milan, once owned by Cardinal Borromeo. Here at Emmaus, perched even more precariously at the table's edge, it casts a shadow in the form of a fish. Can you make it out? The ancient symbol of Christ. These symbolic shadows reinforce the metaphysical nature of Caravaggio's chiaroscuro, the juxtaposition of light and dark, recalling the Latin maxim, lux umbra Dei, light is the shadow of God. The disciples, well, they are deliberately rustic, simple folk, common humanity, realistically rendered, but dignified in their humility. One wears a cockle shell, symbol of a pilgrim, as though to say we are all, even the lowliest of us, pilgrims on the way to Emmaus. Now, Caravaggio was repeatedly criticized for populating his religious pictures with such ordinary people. A friend of mine once remarked he was sure Caravaggio would feel right at home on the IRT. He infuses his religious subjects with a power and conviction, a humanity that is confrontational, yet also reasonable. The disciples, after all, were simple folk, not like the high priests and Pharisees, the establishment of Roman-occupied Palestine. At this time, he was in the midst of his first large-scale ecclesiastical commission for 2 wall paintings for the Contarelli Chapel in the French church of San Luigi dei Francesi, off of Piazza Navona. Devoted to the life of St. Matthew, author of the first gospel, these wall paintings were the first of their kind in Rome to be executed in oil on canvas rather than in fresco. Begun in 1599, they were finished a year later in 1600. And together with their profane counterpart, Carracci's Farnese ceiling frescoes, unveiled that very same year, they herald the dawn of the Baroque in papal Rome. But, unlike the sunny glory of Carracci's overhead frescoes, his overhead revival of Michelangelo and Raphael, Caravaggio's dawn is shrouded in shadow. Are we indoors or out? Light from the upper right, over a wall it seems, yields some clues. In this street or alley, a group huddles around a table, like the card sharps, but here counting money. Christ and St. Peter, at the right, they alone in ancient costume, they turn in their steps as the Lord points and calls the tax collector Levi to a new life as his apostle Matthew, with the simple command, "Follow me." Christ's gesture, again lifted from Michelangelo, here it's Adam's hand in reverse. It reminds us of Caravaggio's use of Christ's traditional epithet as the new Adam, and that we witness here nothing less than a new act of creation. Matthew points to himself, as if to ask, "Who, me?" while his avaricious colleagues, young and old with spectacles, keep on counting. The two young boys, the young dandies, right out of the card sharps, or fortune teller, mainstays of Caravaggio like Shakespeare's colorful walk-on characters with plumed hats and ever-present swords, they look on, puzzled. The light that picks out Christ and this group is, again, metaphysical, with no revealed source, but clearly emanating from our own space outside the picture plane. Perhaps the window covered with oilskin is from Caravaggio's own studio in Del Monte's palace, the same window we saw reflected a few moments ago in the carafe of the boy bitten by lizard. On the opposite wall, he painted the physical violence of Matthew's martyrdom, a scene of cacophony and confusion, and indeed it went through 2 revisions. We are first drawn to the scowling face of this nearly nude pagan executioner as he prepares to deliver the final thrust, the coup de grace. I can't resist showing here on the left Caravaggio's model for this figure. Well, not really. This is a still out of Derek Jarman's wonderful 1986 film, Caravaggio, which can't be had in this country now, but I picked up a DVD a few weeks ago at the Gemälde Gallery in Berlin, and for those of you who are real die-hard Caravaggisti, I recommend you can get the DVD by ordering it on Amazon.de, Amazon Deutschland, and it'll play on American machines. Anyway, there's the figure, and I think it's useful because it does show how Caravaggio might have set up such a scene in his studio. Then, on the right, I don't have the model for this, but the horrified scream of the young acolyte who turns to flee. There he is up close. The divine light of Matthew's heavenly reward is personified by a cloud-supported angel with palm. And in the far background, a self-portrait of the artist looks out at us with a conflicted expression. Is he perhaps the king of Ethiopia who ordered the execution? 2 years later, Caravaggio was commissioned to complete the chapel with an altarpiece of the evangelist Matthew writing his gospel. The first version, destroyed in World War II, was rejected by the priests and immediately purchased by the more discriminating Marchese Giustiniani. Rejected because the saint lacked decorum, his bare foot protruding over the altar toward the priest and viewer, his plebeian face, which was actually a portrait of Socrates, shown as an illiterate whose hand, writing Hebrew, is guided by this androgynous angel. It was, in fact, too sophisticated for traditional taste. A Socratized Matthew proclaiming divine inspiration through divine ignorance. The wisest man is the man who knows he knows nothing, said Socrates. Well, the second version is more traditional, now revealing the same face as the side pictures, taking backhanded dictation, so to speak, as the angel ticks off the generations of Christ's ancestors on his fingers, uno, duo, tre. In 1600, Caravaggio received his second major commission, 2 paintings for another memorial, the Cerasi Chapel of Santa Maria del Popolo. The contract called him egregius in urbe pictor, the city's distinguished painter, and called for the martyrdom of St. Peter and conversion of St. Paul, the 2 chief apostles to Rome, here shown prostrated on either side of the altar. St. Peter, the first pope, is shown crucified upside down as he turns toward the altar and viewer in defiant martyrdom. Note the prominent backside of the executioner and his dirty feet, something no classical artist would have shoved in the viewer's face. Designed for the opposite wall, his first version here of St. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus reveals multi-figured chaos amidst blinding light and Christ's voice, "Saul, Saul, why dost thou persecute me?" embodied in a heavenly apparition, appear as in Michelangelo. But Caravaggio discarded this version, today in the Odescalchi collection, for a revolutionary revision, an unprecedented close-up, emphasizing the horse's hind quarters right out of a Dürer print, editing out the apparition of Christ, which was not mentioned in the Bible, and now relying on gesture and light alone to convey the internal conversion. The symbolic source of this supernatural illumination is a radiant dove of the Holy Spirit, frescoed in the ceiling chapel, in the ceiling of the chapel. But its actual natural source, as I discovered to my surprise one late afternoon emerging from the chapel, is the setting sun that briefly blazes with blinding intensity through a high transept window opposite the chapel. One hostile critic called it an accident in a blacksmith shop. Caravaggio's Saul, dressed as a Roman soldier who has persecuted the new Christians, lies prostrate, his eyes closed. No celestial vision, no external trappings, only an uncomprehending groom, like the innkeeper at Emmaus. Saul's eyes are closed. Everything happens within as Saul is converted into Paul, the future apostle and saint. Other artists had indeed shown his blinded eyes wide open, as we saw in Parmigianino, not Caravaggio. He literally took the Bible at its word. For in the book of Acts we read, Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So, while hearing the heavenly voice, his eyes must have been closed. Simple, logical, faithful to the text. His gesture is the sole sign of the saint's mental state. My first introduction to this work was through a poem in Santa Maria del Popolo by the English poet Tom Gunn, who was poet in residence my freshman year at Princeton. And he was a Caravaggesque figure himself, one of the leather and motorcycle set of poets. A more typical poem of his is entitled "The Unsettled Motorcyclist's Vision of His Death." Well, maybe that's what drew him to this picture. "Oh, wily painter," Gunn asks, limiting the scene from a cacophony of dusty forms to the one convulsion, what is it you mean in that wide gesture of the lifting arms? Then, at the end, he finds his answer in this large gesture of solitary man resisting by embracing nothingness. The outstretched arms, defensive yet embracing, and the sensual vulnerability of the sprawled body, which even the horse respects with raised hoof, suggest the sublimated eroticism of a saint in ecstasy, and call to mind another English poet, the 17th century contemporary, John Donne. "Batter, my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, or throw me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new." And at the end of the sonnet, "For I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me." Paradoxically, at this very time of Caravaggio's deepening religious vision and his success as a painter of almost exclusively large-scale sacred works, his personal life darkened. His name began to appear regularly on the police blotter. He was arrested 14 times and jailed 6 or 7 times over the next 6 years for carrying his sword without a license, for spreading libel against the painter Baglione, for hurling stones at his ex-landlady's window, for hurling a plate at a waiter, for assaults with his sword. By the year 1600, he seems to have moved out of Cardinal del Monte's palace, though on at least 2 of the times he was jailed, he sent to the cardinal for help, and he was always bailed out by eminent friends, including once the French ambassador. At the same time, his longtime companion Mario got married and moved back to Sicily. Caravaggio was now evidently on his own, something of a drifter. 5 years later, he reportedly had no known permanent address. Though well paid for his altarpieces, which he always delivered on time, and given to buying rich clothes, we're told he wore them into rags, ate his meals on a wooden board, covered with an old canvas as a tablecloth. Between work, paraded around the streets from tavern to tennis court, brandishing his sword and dagger, followed by a servant boy and sometimes a black dog named Raven, which reportedly did amazing tricks. His rival Baglione described him as superbo e satirico un poco discolo, haughty and satirical and rather wild. Cardinal del Monte acknowledged he was stravagantissimo, most eccentric. Perhaps that's the closest we can come to comprehending this extraordinarily complex, hot-blooded genius. And perhaps we may glimpse that proud, satiric side of the artist who railed against venerating past masters, who said nature was teacher enough, in his 2 provocative revisions of Michelangelo. The first, a young John the Baptist, stripped of all religious symbols and all clothing, an ambiguous quotation of Michelangelo's Ignudo on the Sistine ceiling. Tra il devoto e profano, as one cardinal complained at the time, between pious and profane. Well, we may compare him with the somewhat more mature St. John. A few years later, today in Kansas City, my favorite Caravaggio in America, a brooding adolescent already suggesting in his smoldering countenance, familiar to any parent of a teenager, the future fire and brimstone prophet. The second, even more pointedly provocative, is this Victorious Amor in Berlin, victorious as in love conquers all, his irreverent one-upsmanship on Michelangelo's idealized statue of victory, there, in Florence. Triumphant Cupid, an impudent urchin with bird's wings, brandishes his arrows as he poses with his battle trophies of civilization and worldly powers. According to one account, this picture, Giustiniani's favorite, was so admired it gained Caravaggio's release from prison. Arrests and imprisonments notwithstanding, the commissions continued. Among his most acclaimed is the masterpiece in the Vatican collection, The Entombment of Christ, commissioned in 1602 for the Chapel of the Pietà in Santa Maria in Vallicella. Echoes of Raphael in the Borghese and Michelangelo's famous Vatican sculpture are incorporated within this triangle of grief. The Virgin, here an old woman, her protective gesture juxtaposed with those of the 2 younger Marys. The choreographed gestures and bodies combine in a wonderful diagonal descant, from right to left, from vertical to horizontal. St. John's hand, there's St. John, presses the side wound as the body is lowered into its grave, the altar and chapel where priest and viewers stand. The protruding corner of the stone, the symbolic stone, Christ as the cornerstone, connecting the 2 spaces and realms. If only one picture could be saved in the Vatican, this would be my choice. And I would never let it cross the Atlantic again to come here, as it did 20 years ago, for the Vatican show, though I'm secretly grateful that it did. His most acclaimed work in its time, it was later copied down the centuries by artists from Rubens to Cézanne. Now, the last of the Roman altarpieces still in place is the Madonna di Loreto in San Agostino. Familiar pilgrims with dirty feet, they kneel in pure faith, representing every man, with humility before a vision of the Madonna and Child at the entrance to her holy house in Loreto, which had been transported miraculously by air express from Nazareth into Italy several centuries earlier. Now, the actual Madonna di Loreto is a votive statue, Caravaggio's statuesque figure. Its effortless pose, defying gravity, is here brought to life like Pygmalion's statue by love and humble faith. The folded hands seem almost to touch the foot of the Christ child, bringing the divine almost into the reach of mortals. He seems to have used this same dark beauty as his model for the large altarpiece for the Palafrenieri, or papal grooms, originally destined for St. Peter's but later relegated to their nearby church until they rejected it. Was it the Christ child's nudity, or his grandmother, St. Anne's, shriveled, wrinkled face? She was the patron saint of the grooms. In any event, it was purchased by Cardinal Borghese, the Pope's nephew. Perhaps the model for this version was indeed the mysterious Lena, described as Caravaggio's woman who stands in the Piazza Navona, over whom he got into a violent brawl and chalked up yet another arrest. A strange symbolic work illustrating the Catholic dogma of the Immaculate Conception, that is, the Virgin's role as co-redeemer in triumphing over evil. She and her new son, as we see together, crush the head of the serpent with their feet. As her mother, St. Anne piously looks on, a quietly evocative, if somewhat stilted, image of the three generations, of the three ages of man. Another contemplative masterpiece, also in the Borghese collection, is this great St. Jerome, translator of the Bible, theologian, and above all, penitent saint, whose own skull beneath the skin compares with the death's head in front of him as a memento mori. Muted colors and somber atmosphere are charged with a dramatic splash of red, as we find again in his last major Roman altarpiece and his most famous rejection, the Death of the Virgin, commissioned in 1605 for the Carmelite Church of Santa Maria della Scala. The apostles gather around the dead mother of Christ, here shown miraculously young. She is barefooted, as indeed are all the apostles, a source of contemporary criticism, as if Caravaggio showed a lack of respect, but in fact befitting a church of barefoot Carmelite monks. Her bright red dress, accentuated above in the weighty bed hangings, also a kind of cloth of honor, a funeral dirge of fabric. Her face alone is bathed in soft light, while a faint gold halo sets her apart from the rest of humanity. The grieving apostles, a series of magnificent variations on a mournful theme, joined by the weeping Magdalene. In the foreground, seated at her feet, there she is, with head bowed before a copper pan of water and cloth with which she had ministered to her Savior's dying mother. John, the beloved disciple, at the place of honor at Mary's head. How unfair the charges that Caravaggio had scandalized the faithful by displaying the swollen corpse of, some said, a prostitute, Perhaps she appeared too human and all too dead for some ecclesiastical tastes, but her poignant dignity is apparent to more sympathetic eyes, and Caravaggio's achievement did not go unrecognized by the young Rubens, who arranged for his patron, the Duke of Mantua, to purchase it, but only after a public viewing in Rome demanded by fellow artists. It later passed to King Charles I of England and Louis XIV of France, not a bad provenance, before landing in the Louvre. But by the time of this vindication by Rubens, Caravaggio had left Rome, had fled Rome on the last day of May 1606. 2 days earlier, in a duel over a tennis match, he, himself badly wounded, had killed his opponent. Now a fugitive from justice, and no doubt with the help of some powerful friends, he had escaped to the Sabine Hill estates of the Colonna family. There he painted his second tellingly somber and muted Supper at Emmaus, an appropriate subject for the painter beginning his own long pilgrimage toward redemption, in his case, a papal pardon for his crime. No more youthful Christ, no bombastic gestures. All is hushed as the familiar bearded Lord reveals himself at a humble meal, the innkeeper, now accompanied by his wife, like the two pilgrims at Loreto. The lighting is dimmer, the colors subdued, the shadows deeper and swallowing the light. A melancholy air pervades this work, reminding us that the vision was only a fleeting one, that Christ would momentarily disappear from their sight, leaving them to ponder his miraculous intervention along their journey. Caravaggio's own journey would take him next to Naples. By autumn, he was at work on a huge altarpiece, the 7 Acts of Mercy for the Church of the Misericordia, a foundation devoted to alleviating suffering in that disease-ridden, poverty-stricken city, the largest in Italy. This subject, or rather assemblage of subjects, is taken from that passage in Matthew's Gospel, I was hungry and you gave me food, thirsty and you gave me drink, a stranger and you took me in, naked and you clothed me, sick and you visited me, in prison and you came to me. To these 6, the traditional 7th Catholic act of mercy is added, burying the dead. In the background, illumined by a torch, now an inexplicit internal source of light in Caravaggio, something new but later so common among his followers, the Caravaggisti, almost lost in the crowd, is Jesus himself. There he is, dressed as a pilgrim with the familiar cockle shell, being welcomed by an innkeeper, illustrating Jesus' pronouncement, inasmuch as you have done it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. Above, intruding on this nighttime street scene, along with metaphysical light, are the Madonna and Child, and this marvelous brace of angels, Caravaggio's most Baroque formulation of heavenly aerodynamics. The following spring of 1607, Caravaggio completed a second Neapolitan altarpiece, the Flagellation for the Church of San Domenico, set in a grim dungeon with muted color and again dark shadows that devour anatomy and surrounding space. A sadistic triangle of torturers enframe the suffering Christ, crowned with thorns, head bowed, being tied to the column before the scourging begins. He alone is bathed in celestial light, lending an almost classical, statuesque dignity as he turns in painful contrapposto. Caravaggio painted his next dungeon scene in Malta, where he sailed in the summer of 1607 in hope of gaining a knighthood. His former master, now the Cavaliere, or knight, d'Arpino, and his nemesis, the painter Baglioni, had both been knighted for their art, and our master of brush and sword sought no less. His portrait of the Maltese Grand Master, today in the Louvre, gained him that coveted knighthood in 1608, a year after his arrival on that fortress island. For the pro-cathedral of St. John, patron saint of the Maltese Knights, he painted the saint's decapitation, a murky yet dramatically spotlit dungeon scene, the grim finale of the Baptist's life. The somber subterranean space opens up around the clustered group of protagonists, the executioner, who's about to sever the Baptist's head with his knife, his sword lying on the ground, the jailer pointing to the platter which is held by Salome, and it's about to receive John's head, her perverse wish granted. Only an anonymous old woman, Salome's attendant, reacts with due horror, clasping her head, while in the background, two prisoners, detached spectators, silently look on. This is the only painting Caravaggio signed. And where? In the crimson drops of the Baptist's blood. All my sins are mortal, Caravaggio was quoted as saying, a confession here writ in blood. Despite the horror, an airless silence permeates the scene. For this painting, Caravaggio was given a gold chain, 2 slaves, and other rewards, a month after becoming a knight. But such honors failed to temper his temper, and he soon landed in a dungeon himself after insulting a noble knight. He escaped down ropes in the dead of night and fled by boat to Sicily, no doubt with the tacit compliance of the Grand Master. An escape from that fortress would otherwise have foiled a Houdini. In Syracuse, he met up with his former companion of happier days, Mario Minetti, who helped him secure the commission to paint the burial of St. Lucy for the church of Santa Lucia over her grave. The grieving figures recede even further into the cavernous silent space as the pitiful early Christian martyr lies stretched out, her throat cut, awaiting burial by 2 burly grave diggers. Even the presiding bishop is relegated to the background. The focal point, with sole splash of color, always red, is given to that mournful young man with hands clasped like a young St. John at the foot of the cross. This final darkening and resonant spaciousness of the late Caravaggio was taken even further in his next major commission for the Church of the Padri Crociferi in Messina. The subject is appropriate to an order devoted to caring for the sick. Christ is shown, as in the calling of Matthew, with the outstretched arm from Michelangelo's Creation of Man, as he calls forth Lazarus to life from the grave. Lazarus suspended between death and life, the skull and the light, with outstretched arms like a crucifix, surely a reference to the Crociferi, or cross-bearing fathers, and also to the original crucifixion on which mankind's resurrection ultimately hangs. Perhaps here, as in no other work, Caravaggio captures that tension between death and life, between the corruptible body and the divine spirit, between his darker nature and the light he sought. Like one of those more tortured characters of Graham Greene, the unlucky ones who believe, as Greene put it. Caravaggio's late religious works share with those of the great 20th century Catholic novelist a profound sense that the line between salvation and damnation is often precariously faint and thin and rarely drawn straight. Before leaving Sicily for Naples, he painted 2 touching nativities, one in Messina, the second for Palermo. That one was stolen in 1969. Both stress the simple and stark humility from the Latin word for earth, humus, of the Savior's birth in earthen, tones of brown. A sadness coupled with awe pervades the two, especially the second, which, despite the intrusive angel announcing God's glory in gesture and Latin translation, Caravaggio's late revival of the traditional conflation of birth and death, of nativity and pietà, in Mary's poignant prescience of her newborn's fate. Back in Naples in 1609, Caravaggio was badly beaten by his enemies, perhaps comrades of the offended knight. He'd been expelled from the Order of Malta a year before. His face was slashed and badly disfigured, but he recovered and remained in Naples for another 9 months before receiving word that a complete pardon was forthcoming from the Pope. En route to Rome, he landed at Porta Ercole, but was mistaken for another fugitive knight and imprisoned for 2 days while his boat sailed on with all his belongings. In furious desperation, he chased after it along the burning sand under the merciless July sun. Finally, his rival Baglioni wrote, he came to a place where he was put to bed with a raging fever, and so, Baglioni concludes, without the aid of God or man, in a few days he died as miserably as he had lived. He was just a few months short of his 39th birthday. Like his earliest works, Caravaggio's final pictures remain shrouded, lost or unidentified. One candidate may be this, the David in the Borghese. Though often dated to his first Neapolitan stay in 1607, it has alternately been relegated to this last year in Naples. Whatever the date, it surely offers a suitably ambiguous and paradoxical work on which to conclude. David, as we see, stands holding in one hand the drawn sword with which he has just severed the head of Goliath, the defeated giant. Here we confront Caravaggio's last and most tragic self-portrait, held in David's extended left hand, as he gazes down at the head with what? Regret? Pity? Compassion? A traditional prefiguration, as well as ancestor of Christ, David, posed like a figure of justice with sword and scales, evokes the Lord of the Last Judgment. How far we have come from that other Michelangelo's David, the proud embodiment of adolescent virility and virtue. Yet, even here, there is a final, far more profound and confessional link between our two Michelangelos. For this gruesome self-portrait of Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio recalls Michelangelo Buonarroti's own late self-portrait, a tragic self-portrait on the flayed skin of the martyred Saint Bartholomew in the Last Judgment. Perhaps Caravaggio, having paid a terrible earthly price for his dark side and unsheathed sword, could yet, through his brush, express a faint hope of finding in that final judgment absolution and light. Thank you.